Folks, tonight I'm actually going to do a little something different from what we've done in the past. We're going to be talking about an era of our history that I really haven't spent that much time talking about. It's the first 50 years, sort of after our founding, up to around 1910 or so. It's a period that's a bit distant in time and may feel a little bit less relevant than the more recent periods that we talked about. But as I think about it, it's a time when some of the habits and culture of our church got established and then went through some significant changes. If we think about ourselves today, and I looked at our website and how we describe ourselves to the world, we prominently talk about ourselves as a welcoming congregation with people from a variety of faith backgrounds, many who come to us with humanist values, perhaps atheistic or agnostic in their personal beliefs, and don't feel at home in more mainstream churches. We talk in our vision about honoring the holiness in each other and in all that is. I think we think of ourselves as religiously, intellectually, and socially progressive, even if we don't talk about, use that word overtly, but in the sense that we favor more liberal ideas theologically and politically. We strive to operate in our church democratically and give all of our members a voice in governance matters. And I'd say we're quite globally minded in our concerns, or we aspire to be. But then I would go on to say we were not always all of these things. It would probably be a stretch to say that at one point in time we were none of these things. But I would say that at various times we were not each of these things. We're now 170 years on since our founding, and in some ways, the gradual changes in our church were due to changes in the makeup of the town of Belmont. The character of the town has changed a good deal since its days as a sort of a pastoral agricultural community. The town has certainly grown in population and density. It's now an older settled community. Some of the changes have been in response to changes in our wider American culture. And I think some were in response to specific events here at the church, some of which I would describe as events that were pain points, problems that surfaced that caused us to do things differently. And then there are always those chronically painful aspects of sustaining a church community that never completely go away. Sometimes there are difficult relations within a congregation or between the leadership and the ministers. The relations are not always smooth and harmonious. Money is always tight. I think that's kind of a rule of in most churches, not all. And I would say over time in ours, our ambitions have always tended to exceed our means. Property cares are always a worry. Enthusiasm and participation and attendance at worship wax and wane. And we have the chronic issue of the burnout of volunteers who just feel stressed after many years of devoted efforts. So those are all chronic issues. But my overriding interest, I think I talked about this when Jim first asked me to take on and succeed him in the role of being lead historian. I do believe that by better understanding our past, we can become a better and more vibrant and thriving church community in the present and in the future. And it's for that reason that I've been looking forward for several months to a deeper look at this period of time and preparing this talk that I've titled Growing Pains. As always, I'm relying a great deal on Jim's wonderful 150th anniversary history to provide an overall framework. And I want to encourage everybody, both on the call and if there are others that look at the video in the future, to really look to that history as the best comprehensive reference history of our church. So I'm going to be looking at several episodes and using a bit of archival material to discuss challenges we faced in the following areas: in governance, in ministerial relations, the selection retention and occasional parting of ways with our ministers, the finance issues that arose during this period, gender roles, and the participation of women specifically in the first 50 years, and the broad issue of attendance and enthusiasm at our worship services, mode of worship, and finally, I think seeds were planted in this first 50 years in our approach toward outside charity and what today we would call social action. Now, what we can say on all of these topics is limited by the available evidence that we have, both in our archives, and I spend a fair amount of time looking for other contemporaneous sources. So we always have only a partial picture, and as historians, we always have to be open to revising our understanding of the past whenever we come across information that challenges or contradicts the understanding that we already have. So I'll be speaking, I imagine, for about 30, 40 minutes, and I'd be very interested in hearing your contrasting views on what I have to share. So let's kick off with, I've got a slide up here showing pictures of some of our early lay leaders, and we'll talk a bit about governance. From the outset, we had a small parish committee, initially 3 men. It was then expanded to 5, and it was men for the first 25 or 30 years of our existence. And for the most part, all of them were considered leaders in the community. They were generally older, wealthier members of the church, and for the most part from the most prestigious families in the church. So we're looking here at Samuel Meade, Samuel Hammett, Oliver Wellington, and William Underwood. Except for Hammett, they were all from longtime elite Belmont families. And I think Hammett was quite well known in the community, although he did end up leaving Belmont and moving to Newton later in his life. And these members would be succeeded by others, the Fletchers, and especially the Atkins family, starting in the 1880s and 90s. The Atkins family would then have a dominant role for the next 30 plus years at our church. And Edwin Atkins would remain as titular head of the parish board for, I think, 25 years, even in years when he couldn't be at the church because business took him to Cuba. And so in any event, these were the men who took on the challenge of establishing our church, fighting for the incorporation of the town, putting up our first building, and they put in a good 5 years, really, from about 1854 to around 58 or 59 to get our church established, the building built, up and running. Good. Is somebody not muted?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. In any event, initially, all of our parish board members served 1-year terms, and they got reelected annually. And I would say there was a presumption that once you were on the committee, you would stay sometimes for several years. There was no fixed plan for rotation until much later. And certainly nothing like the, I think, quite well articulated plan that we now have since our 2005 bylaw revision. But there were at times periods of frustration and burnout. I think, Lillian, if you jump to the next slide, there's a passage in our records. Yeah, there, if you just slide up. So this is March of 1858. And we see that Hammett is voted onto the board, but a number of other gentlemen declined to serve, including, let's see, Mack, Locke, Homer Jr., Wellington, Wynne, Alexander. So these were some of the folks that had been involved in the early effort. But I think we've seen this over the years. People spend several years hard at work on a project related to the church, and then they're asked to continue and they hit burnout. And we'll encounter it again when we turn to finances, and specifically the role of the treasurer. I think one thing that was quite distinctive about the early period of our history was the treasurer would personally backstop the debts of the church and often lend their own funds in order to keep the church afloat. And that caused periods of tension between the church and the treasurer, which we'll hear about. The clerks from the outset were all men. I think there may have been a woman that served as clerk, but I'm not sure. 1899, Mrs. Atkins, Catherine Atkins, Edward's wife, stepped in as the pro tem clerk. And then she rotated onto the board and she became a leader for the next 30 odd years. But in the early going, it was pretty much exclusively men that had the leadership roles, and we'll be talking about gender roles later on in the talk. I'd now like to shift gears and talk about the experience of our early ministers. And so, Lillian, if you can scroll down to this next slide features images. We're looking at Amos Smith, our first minister. We have no image of our second minister, settled minister, whose name was Harvey Bates, was with us for just a couple of years and left, and we'll talk about that. In the middle, we have Ivory Waterhouse. You may recognize that name. He was a much beloved minister, but only with us for about 6 or 7 years when he died. And then on the right is John Gilman, and again, a relatively short tenure. In the early days of the congregational tradition, if we go back to the 17th and 18th centuries and look at the early era of the congregational tradition from which we sprang, there was an ideal that churches would invite a young man, and it was always a man, who would bond with his flock and remain a lifelong pastor until his retirement or death. But we're now in the mid-19th century. That tradition was in decline. It did still exist. Many churches had settled ministers with tenures of 20 or 30 years or more. I've actually done a little genealogy and learned I had a great-great-grandfather who was, for 45 years, the pastor of the church in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, the Congregational Church. We never had an experience like that. I would say the first minister we had with a long, happy tenure from which he retired would probably be Henry Wilder Foote, who retired in 1940. So the early days were a bit rocky, and I'm going to talk about some of the experiences and some of the less happy experiences, frankly, during this period of time. So Amos Smith came to us in 1857. He was our first pastor. He was highly regarded in the Unitarian denomination. He had been ordained in Boston, served in the historic church of Ralph Waldo Emerson. He came to Belmont. He was also head of our school committee. And the church got off to a strong start, but the records indicate that across the 1860s, the spirits of the church began to flag. Attendance fell, revenues declined, and as members became lethargic and failed to pay their pew taxes, we'll talk about pew taxes here in a moment, the church's financial condition deteriorated. And in 1872, we read in the records that the parish committee was directed to communicate the condition of the church to the minister. And a short while later, he resigned. He was only 56 years old. He was not an old man. And there was no direct dismissal. But I have the sense that he must have been sort of gently ushered out in order to be replaced by a more energetic leader. And a few years later, he was offered a free pew at the church. He remained a member of our congregation until his death in 1887. And our minister at that time, Hilary Bygrave, gave a lovely eulogy to Amos Smith. We have that in the archives. It's probably the earliest sermon to be delivered from our pulpit that we have the text for. And it gives a wonderful portrait of Amos Smith, the individual, and why he was an esteemed clergymen in our Unitarian tradition. So the church was then without a minister for a period of several months, and there was no formal search process in place at the denomination level. We didn't have anything like today's UUA with the search process and the hiring of interims and so forth. I think, Lillian, if you slide down one slide, yes. Okay, so here we have the call being issued to Harvey Bates. And the committee's meeting, and they mentioned that at the last meeting, we had talked about Reverend H.C. Bates, who we invited to preach for 2 Sundays. And we gave him a call, which was accepted. The society was very pleased with him, and the parish committee voted unanimously under the power that they had been delegated to issue a call to him to become the pastor of the society. So it was sort of I wouldn't call it spur of the moment, but hasty decision, and it arose from nothing like the kind of elaborate search process that we now go through, where we prepare a binder and there are many candidates and many churches looking, and there's a match effort facilitated by the denomination. It was very much an ad hoc process in this day. And as it happens in Bates's case, it didn't really work out. It was right around this time that the church decided, in order to be able to attract a pastor, we needed to have a parsonage. And we acquired a lot across the street from the church. It was actually next door to the Johnson House on the far side. It's now that paved driveway area for the parsonage of the Armenian Congregational Church a few doors down from us. And so the church invited Bates to become our minister. He was promised a salary of $1,300. Jim, in his wonderful history, recounts how Bates might have had some reason for skepticism. He responded in his own letter of acceptance, "If I thought your salary was small as it is because you are a stingy people, I would most certainly decline to be your minister." But he decided to come just the same. He had a very auspicious beginning. At his ordination service, the sermon was preached by the great Boston minister Edward Everett Hale. Attendance quickly rebounded at our church. It had fallen to about 40 or 50 people on Sundays during the latter days of Amos Smith. But attendance came up to more than 100, and the affairs of the church seemed to be on solid ground. But here's
John,
what, yeah.
do you have any information? I mean, Everett Hale, Edward Everett was a very famous minister. How did we manage to pull that one off? There must be an interesting connection there.
Next year, we're going to be talking about him, actually. Edward Everett Hale, I've just been reading a couple of biographies of him, as well as his famous uncle, Edward Everett.
Yes.
So it was a coup to get Hale at our church. And in fact, you know that sign I think it's in the conference room, look up, look down, look out, not in, lend a hand. He was the originator of the phrase lend a hand and the Lend a Hand Society. Yeah, quite a remarkable man. So it's my hope and intention to have a more detailed talk about Edward Everett Hale at some point next year. So, but here's what happened with our parsonage. We put up the building, the house, we offered Bates a salary of $1,300. And then the second year, the church parish committee decided that they should dock him by $200 to account for the housing. So he effectively, having felt like the offer was stingy to begin with, he then was handed a $200 pay cut. Unsurprisingly, he left a few months later, and the church was once again without a minister. So that was a rather bitter learning. And we then went through yet another period of transition. And Lillian, I think there's 2 slides down. At the next slide, yes, this critical moment, the transition from Bates to Waterhouse. Let's read a little bit about where the church stood in 1877. The condition a year ago was apathetic. No particular reason was assigned, therefore, but the fact remained too prominent and of too long standing to allow for us indulging the hope of a better state of things without radical change. The pastor resigned in midsummer, since which event the old-time energy of the society has asserted itself. And we believe it will go on and develop a state of usefulness of a better and more enduring nature than any the society has yet known. Our new pastor, this is Ivory Waterhouse, brings with him the prestige of success. And the next annual report of your parish committee, we are well assured, will tell of larger growth with increased spiritual strength. So hopefully a turn in a more optimistic direction. That was the hope in 1878. And Ivory Waterhouse was a successful, devoted, hardworking minister. He worked himself to exhaustion, and tragedy struck. He was sick one winter, and doing parish visits, he went around and called on people at their homes. Coming out of somebody's home, he fell and injured his leg, was bedridden, and developed complications and died at the age of 50. So that was an unexpected and tragic turn in the fates of the church. And we then extended a call to Gilman, who came in 1884, but only lasted 2 years. So we had this really long period of instability. The next settled minister, I guess we can go down one more slide, Lillian, and we'll see a picture of, on the left, this is Hilary Bygrave. He would be with us for 14 years. So that's a comparatively long tenure, the longest since Smith at that point. And unfortunately, let's see, I guess Edwin Atkins became our parish committee chair in 1890. And that's when the Atkins went from being summer residents to he really became, the family settled and became full-time residents here in Belmont. But I think what we see evidence of in when Bygrave's time came was that Edwin Atkins was something of an autocratic parish committee chair. And there seems to have been some animus between him and Bygrave. And there were instructions were given to communicate to Bygrave that there was disaffection in the society and that Bygrave should take the initiative and offer his resignation. And this led to a real crisis in the church. And the parish committee en masse announced their intent to resign, which I have to believe was in protest. And there were a flurry of meetings that took place in 1901 to try to reverse that and encourage him to come back. Because I think it was at Atkins's direction. But Bygrave did offer his resignation. The church did vote overwhelmingly to ask him to reconsider. But I think because he felt he didn't, the chairman did not have his back, he insisted on going through with his resignation. And Atkins continued to hold the reins. He remained head of the parish board into the mid-19-teens and on the board for a few more years. He died in 1926. The last thing I'm going to mention on this whole score, now we are looking at, I guess that's George Hale Reed and Charles Billings were 2 other relatively short tenure ministers before Henry Wilderfoot arrived in in 1924. There was a proposal put forward in 1909 by a board member, a committee member, Harold Birch, asking that the engagement and dismissal or resignation of the pastor shall not be made or demanded or accepted by the parish committee except as authorized by a vote of the members of the society called for that purpose. And this motion was defeated. So, which really, that tells you sort of the state of democracy at the Belmont Congregational Society at that era. It was power was exercised, I think, very centrally during the Edwin Atkins era. So overall, relations with our ministers, it seems to me, were rocky. We did not have long and stable relations. And it was a far cry, I think, from today's process, which is, I think, much more open, deliberate, democratic. Sometimes it feels cumbersome and unwieldy. Sometimes I know I've heard talk in the church, we thought we found the right person, or we had a wonderful interim. Why can't we just take things into our own hands? But there is a reason why we have been moved in this direction, and why the UUA in general has all churches have moved in the direction of having a more deliberative process for ministerial searches and calls to new ministers. So anyway, that's just I thought some interesting background on our experience with settled ministers in the first 50 years. Maybe
John,
I'll take a pause. Sure. Is that Bill?
yeah, I had a question, which was to what extent did Atkins and his family basically control the church because they were basically funding the church? I mean, did he get 20 votes and everybody else got one vote on the parish board because they weren't willing to pay what the Atkins family was paying to keep the church afloat? So what Atkins wanted, Atkins got?
I think there's probably some truth to that, Bill, that money talks. That's been the case in the past. I know in the Legacy of Slavery project, there's been a focus on the fact that, was our church built with slave money and money earned on the backs of slave labor? My research suggests that the largest contributor to the capital cost of building the church in 1890 was actually Varnum Fletcher, the banker and beef merchant who was our first state senator from Belmont. He contributed something like $5,000 out of $30,000 total cost of the building. Probably the equivalent of like a $150,000, $200,000 pledge toward $1 million building in today's terms. So the Atkins gift would have been smaller than that for the initial building. For the renovation in there was the parish hall in 1924, to which they made a substantial contribution, although we don't know specifically. Underwoods gave more money for the parish hall. Catherine Atkins did make the very generous gift of the organ in 1930 on the condition that the church fund the remodel to accommodate the organ. And I have no doubt that Catherine Atkins, in the years after Edwin's death, did make up a lot of the deficits through time. I don't know specifically, and I don't know that we'll ever know how much Edwin Atkins backstopped the church's finances. I imagine it must have been fairly substantial, but the church did operate on a pretty sparse budget throughout these years. And I've actually, we'll talk a bit about financing, and I'm really focused more on the era leading up to 1900, I guess, in these next comments. So, but I have no doubt that the fact that he was one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest person in Belmont, gave him the ability to exercise his will somewhat autocratically.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Okay. So I was going to shift gears now and talk a bit about finances. I think it's going to be a moment, Lillian, before I get into another slide. So um, I, I don't want to belabor too many of the details of finances. It might at some point be interesting to look at some sample budgets from the 1860s and 70s up to the turn of the century to into the mid 20th century to see how our budgeting process became more elaborate and complex through time. There might have been 6 items on the budget, the minister's salary and the cost of fuel and the cost of paying a boy to pump the organ and insurance. It was very simple in the early days, and it did become more complicated over the course of the first 50 years. We had no endowment at all, didn't have an endowment until well into the 20th century. The first building that went up in 1857. Why don't we switch to that slide? I think it's the next one. Yeah. So we have here an image of our old building, Carpenter Gothic, as it's described, not terribly well built, chronically in need of repairs. And how did we finance our operations? Well, at the very beginning, there was I guess what would be described as a Dutch auction, where the pews, the seats were put up for auction, and whoever offered the highest price got their choice of seat. And then the seats were continued to be auctioned off until they were all auctioned. I think there were 59 pews in this church, which suggests to me that it was like 15 rows, 4 across. So picture, we have no imagery of the interior of this church, but I imagine there was a center aisle and 2 side aisles. So you would have pews on the side, pews in the middle, 4 across. So 59 pews were auctioned, and then there would be an annual tax on the pew that you acquired through the auction process. The tax was set at 23%. So whatever you first bid to get your pew, you were committed to pay 23% of that price going forward. When that became insufficient, it was raised to 26%. And this is a not unusual way wasn't at that time for churches to fund themselves. I think it's still common in the Jewish tradition to have a price for a pew. I think of it kind of like getting a box seat at Fenway or at the TD Garden. And whether you use it or not, you are committed to it. And once you were committed to a pew, it was an ongoing obligation. When folks fell behind, we read in our records that the parish committee would periodically authorize members to go out and, quote, settle with delinquent taxpayers. So it was a system of enforced contribution to the extent that you could force folks to pay for their church pew. And if they really weren't able to pay, the church would try to settle and not lose members. But it had to have led to bad feeling within the church, especially at times when members were becoming less excited or motivated if they didn't like the pastor, or the pastor was losing his mojo, as seems to have happened at certain times. Now, to relieve pressure on the pew tax system, over time, other methods of fundraising were added. We read about ladies' entertainments to raise money, occasional voluntary subscriptions. And when capital funds were needed, on occasion, the church would turn to wealthy members to loan funds at interest to the church. So members of the parish would become creditors to the church. And again, probably not terribly unusual. Eleazar Homer, who would have been, I think, an uncle or maybe a great uncle of the artist, provided a fairly substantial loan to backstop construction of the church in the 1850s. But pew taxes remained in place as the primary funding mechanism until 1895. And it was at that time that the parish committee decided to consider a plan to release all seating privileges. And basically, they moved over the next several years to eliminate pew taxes. At first, they thought about having a minimum price per seat, but ultimately in the 1900s, they said all seats will be free, and we're going to have to raise this amount through a voluntary subscription. So voluntary offerings, first as a supplement, and then as really the primary, if not, and then exclusive basis of funding, began in the 1880s. I think it was around 84, 85 that the first formal pledge committee was put in place. Jim mentions this in his history. And it was decided to have a system where you paid in 4 quarterly installments to make it easier. So it didn't come all as one bite at a certain time of year. Now, the church was, as I said, built in 1857. It was plagued by problems and needed repairs from the outset. The cost was $7,000. And if we use the CPI deflator, I would estimate this was the equivalent of about a $250,000 construction job by today's standards. By comparison, our later church would be well more than $1 million in today's currency. So to offset the cost of building and operating the church, we did decide to allow the town to use the vestry for town hall meetings in the very, very early years. And also from around 1873 for a period of several years, we rented space to the town of Belmont for a library in our vestry. And that brought in about $150 a year, which was about 7% of our $2,000 budget. So it was a meaningful contribution. But there was concern expressed by the parish committee about giving up too much space. With increased prosperity, we shall soon need all the room for ourselves. So space has always been a consideration. Toward the end of this period is when the town really started to take off. Membership was growing, and that's when we rented space in the Tudor block, the old commercial block that's now occupied by it used to be Belmont Savings Bank. What's the name of the bank these days with the adjacent? Yeah, with the adjacent parking garage. So that's where folks would walk across the train tracks and or under the bridge, I guess, after the bridge was done, to have additional space for functions and religious education. Now, the parsonage, the map that you see on the right shows where the church was located, that in that little wedge between the railroad and Concord Avenue, and the parsonage was directly across the street. How to house our minister has always been an issue, not just since housing costs surged in Belmont and Greater Boston. In the early 1870s, the church acquired a lot and build a parsonage nearby, but we ended up only holding it for about 15 years. It was intermittently not used, of course, when we had vacancies with our settled minister, and we ended up selling the parsonage in around 1887 as part of the plan to finance the new church. And I think the next time we had a parsonage was 1941, and that was the house up on Horace Road that the church owned for probably another 30, 35 years. Okay, let's go on. I'll talk a few minutes. I don't have a slide for the topic of, I guess, Lillian, yes, Uh, this I thought was a pretty remarkable quote about. I'm talking about the stress of on the job of treasurer. Um, as I mentioned a moment ago, the treasurer often personally would backstop the indebtedness of the church and would be authorized to seek loans, but in many cases, the treasurer would be a creditor to the church. At some points, the church would owe the treasurer two, 300, and 1 year up to $400, which was the equivalent today of like $12,000. So it's tough enough to be a volunteer treasurer for a church, but to have to provide money out of pocket to backstop its operations really seemed a bit too much. And as a result, we did have times of tension. I think our model today, where we have an endowment, we have a stabilization fund that we can dip into in some years and replenish in other years, so that there's stability of operations. You know, our current plan, if we can possibly manage it, to get a bookkeeper on staff so that we can alleviate the burden of the role of treasurer, all critical, because it's a vital role, and it's always been a difficult role to fill, and it's sometimes painful and poignant to read about the difficult relations between treasurer and church. And I'm going to get to one very special treasurer before the end of the talk. So, charity and social action. The church first began to take up a collection for outside charities in about 1888. And most of the charities were local, and the gifts were relatively small. They weren't systematically prioritized. We didn't have anything quite as elaborate as today's social action committee, or you know, a collaborative effort to decide on who our charitable priorities should be. But there are some notable examples of where we sent charitable gifts in this first half century. They include the Tuskegee Institute. There was a new church opened in Stoneham that we supported at 1 year. I forget if it was 1890 or in the late 80s. There was the great Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania, and we contributed to the relief effort. It was in 1890 that Edwin Atkins became joined the parish board, and the next year became chairman. And he moved very quickly to set up a number of committees to improve the operations of the church. And one of them was a, quote, committee on missionary and benevolent action to determine how to allocate our charitable gifts. And over time, from this point on, we were giving about 5 to 10% of our annual budget, so not insignificant. Most of the outside charity went to locally focused, our local hospital, for instance, the Waltham Hospital we supported for a number of years. Later on, we would provide support for our sister. We had a sister church relationship. We talked about this at the January Transylvania history presentation in church. And then, of course, in the later period of time, I think it was really with the arrival of the Dexters, Robert and Elizabeth Dexter, who played such a central role in kicking off the Unitarian Service Committee. The role of social action in our church really moved to the forefront. So interesting that the beginnings were really in that late 1880s period. Okay, the next topic I wanted to address, and I'm just going to check and see. Let's see. Let's go here to the slide on Maria Livermore. I've talked about her in the past. I would love to find a picture of her because she is an important and largely unsung character in our history. The first woman to be an officer in the church leadership. She was our treasurer for 7 years, and toward the end of her tenure as treasurer, there was this entry in one of the records, which I think describes how difficult a role it must have been. It's the treasurer serves without compensation. Imagine if it's hard for one family to trifle and with putting off debts, how much harder it must be to take on the sins of 100 families on her shoulders. And yet this is what we expect our treasurer to do. So I thought that this passage in particular conveys the difficulty of the role of treasurer and how much was expected of her at this time. And in particular, because she was not even accorded the privilege of being an official member of the church. Women at the outset, it is interesting that women participated in the call to Amos Smith in the 1850s. We have a list of the folks that issued that call, but they were not official members. Men would provide the capital funds for, I'll get to that next slide in a moment, Lillian. Men would provide the capital funds for the new building, but it was expected that it would fall to the ladies to raise funds for furnishings and adornments, the pulpit, the bell, the carpeting, seat cushions. And as I mentioned, ladies' entertainments to raise funds to make up the budget shortfalls that took place from year to year. So Maria was the unmarried daughter of a prominent grower in a section of Watertown that became part of Belmont. The Livermore family, who's commemorated in the naming of Livermore Road, switched their affiliation from their Watertown church to become very loyal members of Belmont for many years. Maria played the role of treasurer for 7 years. She served on a committee of 5 ladies to raise money to repaint the church in the late 1870s. And in 1880, she seems to have hit burnout, or I guess this 1878. And we hear the parish committee express concern about potentially losing their treasured lady secretary. And in 1883, she finally resigned as treasurer, and she signed the membership book, and she's joined. And why don't we flip forward, Lillian, to the next slide? She is joined by 8 other members who join on the same day. So here the clerk is recording the names first of Maria and then of her 8 fellow women members of the church. This was actually a suffragist moment in the history of Belmont. One of these women, Mary Frances Wellington Homer, the second name, was the oldest child of Oliver Wellington. She was the mother of the architect, Eleazar Homer, who designed the Homer building, the town high school. And she was a leader in the suffragist movement in Massachusetts. And she was the first woman to vote in a Belmont school committee election in 1885. So I just imagine the sort of teeming frustration that Maria might have had with the treasurer's role and not having the privilege of membership. And when she busted down the doors and these 8 women followed, and you look at it, if you can see on the left, there had been a dearth of new members for pretty much the previous decade, 5 or 6 members in the previous decade. And then all at once, we have a dozen new members, 9 women joining in, I guess, 9 women and 2 men joining in a single year. So, as I said, I'd love to learn more about Maria, and I've searched all over for information about her. uh, so far unsuccessfully, but I'm going to keep an eye out. I think I have one more slide substantively. This is just an image of the um, hymnal and service book that belonged to Mrs. Alicia Atkins. This would be Mary Freeman, the mother of Edwin Atkins and wife of Alicia or Elisha. And on the inside cover is the order of service that was used in our church. I think one of the key differences that I imagine any of us would notice when if we were to walk in on a Sunday morning 100 plus years ago, 150 years ago, was just how different the feel of the service was. It was very scripted, very standard. There were about 10 orders of service. If you look in this book, which was published by the American Unitarian Association, there were a number of different hymnals at that time, but the 1890 hymnal that we have in our archives has something like 800 hymns, 10 orders of service. It looks and feels and reads very much like the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, stripped of sort of references to the deity of Jesus and the Trinity. So it did have, and this is sort of to Charlie's point. Charlie, you've mentioned this in the past. Our church really did have the feel of a Episcopal church, but denatured of the doctrine of the Trinity, is how I would describe the difference between worship services then and worship services today. I mean, I think one of the things we love about our church is the nature of worship does change very much from week to week. It's always something new and different. But I think that our predecessors probably treasured the predictability and regularity of the services. So I think that's another critical difference that we would have felt if we were to time travel and appear in our church all that time ago. Let's drop down to the next. I think this next one is our next to last slide, Lillian, if you could. Oh, yes. I just wanted to put in a final word about attendance and enthusiasm. This is from, I think, the period of Ivory Waterhouse, 1878. And you find these references periodically. Folks who didn't turn out, the stay-at-homes, or the flagging enthusiasm, or we read, I guess, previously about the sense of apathy or loss of energy. There's always been an ebb and flow of energy in the church, and I think it's unsurprising that that's the nature of religious communities. I think we always have to simply focus on what can we do to restore that energy, but we shouldn't think that it was different in the past. I think it was I read going through this period of time about periods of time when the energy was low and folks were staying at home. So that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about. I have one final slide with a few thoughts, and at this point I really do want to stimulate some see what kind of reactions folks have. Jim, in his history, mentions and quotes from an earlier talk that from the beginning, our church was Unitarian, congregational in government, Unitarian in belief and spirit. I think that's certainly true, but I think we have to add that these terms had a very different meaning at the outset than they did today. More the Unitarian than the congregational. I think we've maintained a strong tradition of congregation-based government, although there's more, I think, in some ways, more influence from the central UUA over UU churches than there was in the past. But the sort of what it means to be a Unitarian, I think, was different in 1850 from 1950 and 1950 from today. So next point, we've had difficult experiences throughout our history. I think we've learned a lot of good lessons. I think we've improved our governance. We have, I think, much better democratic participation and much better communications between the congregation and our ministers today than we did in the past. We don't have that role of an autocratic head of the parish committee controlling communications that I sense was the case in the past. Financing is always going to be an issue, but we are much more robustly funded today than we were in the past. As I study our early history and really the entire history of our church, I've become convinced that we really should strive to maintain and continually build a healthy endowment. And I think that's something, I know I mentioned this in church on Zoom a few weeks back with our relaunch of the Babcock Legacy Society. I personally have decided I'd encourage all of you on the call to consider, if you can, leaving a planned gift to the church, if that's possible within your means. I think we're a much more welcoming church today than in the past. There was talk in the early days about how does the church manage to meet its challenges. One of the best ways would be through the speedy accession of desirable new members. I think there was, on the one hand, a recognition that churches always need to welcome new folks in. But I think there was a clear sense we want the desirable people. We don't want to open our doors to everybody. I feel like we're very much more open. The church of the friendly welcome is what Henry Wilder Foote talked about. And I think that is what we aspire to be and what we really need to be and ought to be in the town of Belmont today. I touched on burnout. It's always an issue. I think it always will be an issue, but I think we have a much better approach with rotation of leadership to guard against it. But it's always important to have many shoulders so that we can spread the work around.